2024. It's been years of ups and downs for the games industry, but despite it all, there were plenty of games that came out this year, and I barely played any of them. Don't get me wrong, I played plenty of games during the last 12 months, but for me, this year's mainly been one for discovering older games, and I've played some great ones along the way. This video is titled something along the lines of My Games of the Year 2024, but really it's more of a rundown of the games I played during the year, rather than only my favourites. Gotta have that clickable title or something. Technically, I only played about half of Super Mario Bros. Wonder in 2024, since I got it for Christmas last year, but I beat it in 2024, so I think it counts for this video. It's excellent, obviously, with lovely visuals, really creative levels, and controls tuned to perfection. I even bothered to 100% the game, standees aside, which must say something about its quality, since I wouldn't call myself a completion-driven gamer most of the time. All in all, I had a great time getting through all this game had to offer, though I'm not sure when I'll get the urge to replay it, which is kinda similar to how I feel about a lot of Mario games really. 64 is still the king of replayable Mario games to me. And of course, there's a certain other platformer series that has me hooked in for constant replays. I still miss Dragalia Lost. I played that game daily before it shut down, and my phone and PC wallpapers are still Dragalia themed to this day. Playing and loving this game also put the developer Cygames on my radar, and so when I realised it was out, Little Noah Scion of Paradise sat on my eShop wishlist, ready for when the time was right to give it a go. And this year I decided, yeah, the time's right. It's a nice little roguelite, with an interesting moveset system, where your attacks are technically allies you recruit that all have their own type of attack that you string into a combo. I haven't actually been back to play since playing enough to beat the story, which might be evident from the gameplay footage. I don't know, I haven't recorded it yet. So it should probably join my ever-growing list of I really need to get back to these games. And speaking of Cygames, they released Granblue Fantasy Relink this year, which is definitely on my list of games to try out at some point. And maybe it'll feature in my 2025 games list. I don't play them all the time, but I like a good beat 'em up. There's just something satisfying about beating down hordes of enemies in a semi-3D side-scrolling environment. And I've been in the VTuber and Hololive rabbit holes for quite a few years now. These interests collide in Holobreak, so of course I had to give it a go, especially since it's a free fan game. As a Sonic fan, I'm well aware of the talent fan game creators possess, and this game is no exception, having been directed by KU, who has experience working both on beat-em-ups and other Hololive projects, and is full of the kind of fan service that you see so often in fan projects. Unfortunately, despite liking beat-em-ups, I also suck at them. I really had to spam heals to beat the final boss of this one, because I'm terrible at dodging. Also, it didn't help that I beat it before a save feature was added to the game, but that was helped by the Steam Deck's sleep mode. Maybe at some point I'll be able to rope someone into playing co-op with me, since these games are always more fun with a friend. And yes, the X is silent. Have you ever wanted to play a weird mashup of Rayman 2, Rayman Raving Rabbids, and a completely separate third Rayman concept that never saw the light of day? No? Well, that's probably why the DS version of Rayman Raving Rabbids feels so obscure. Everyone knows the story of how Rabbids on console changed from an action game to a minigame collection, and you might be familiar with the GBA game, taking elements from Phoenix Studios' cancelled Rayman 4 project. The DS game is something else entirely, using Rayman 2's engine as a base, and thankfully much more responsive to control than Rayman DS. Rabbids DS presents a 2D platformer based on Rayman 2's gameplay, with a few of its own twists. It's a weird feeling with gameplay that's so familiar to me, but with slight tweaks that make it just feel slightly off. But overall, I think it works. I wound up being pretty impressed with how competent this game was, especially with the general reputation of obscure handheld ports that are completely different to their console counterparts. The autorunner sections even reminded me of the Murphy levels in Rayman Legends, and while I doubt this was an inspiration for that game, it makes for an interesting coincidence nonetheless. And there's also random touchscreen minigames every now and then, but the less said about those the better. It's also kind of jarring hearing music cues that I've only ever associated with specific minigames on the Wii version, but the music winds up fitting decently well, and the super compressed Rabid covers of the licensed songs will never not be funny to me, especially when they just start playing at random on a platformer stage. I managed to check another game off the ever-shrinking list of Sonic games I haven't played this year, when I got the opportunity to pick up Sonic Riders Zero Gravity for a good price. For years I've been led to believe that the motion controls in this game are completely busted and make the game near unplayable, so imagine my surprise when I got through the story mode just fine, mostly using the motion controls. Maybe I just have a high tolerance for motion control BS. I mean, I have been warming up to Secret Rings after all. Or maybe it's due to the devs seemingly overcorrecting the mechanical depth of the first Riders game, where in that one you have to be paying full attention to even be in the race, let alone to win it. Zero Gravity's mechanics are centred around its gravity gimmick, which pretty much boils down to a visually cool but somewhat repetitive drift mechanic and the pretty situational gravity dive. I did have a pretty good time with the game despite this, and the presentation probably helped a lot. The story is nonsense, as you'd expect from a racing game with a story, and it doesn't overstay its welcome either, which is nice. And as repetitive as the gravity stuff can be, doing it often at the same place every lap, it's kinda worth it for the dynamic music, shifting to the next phase of the track whenever you shift gravity. Is it one of the all-timers in the Sonic racing game lineage? Of course not. Racing Transformed exists after all, but it was better than I was expecting it to be. My boy, this game is what all true YTPers strive for. My internet humour is often stuck in the mid to late 2000s era YouTube where CDI based YouTube poops were all the rage, and so I knew I had to pick up RZ, the Jewel of Faramar, at some point after it came out. And immediately, you can tell this is a passion project, made not only by people who know the source material and what people find funny about it, but also by people who can make a fun game. RZ is basically an answer to the question, what if the Zelda CDI games were actually fun? And basically plays out as a light Metroidvania game, where you have to explore mostly linear levels that you select from a world map, and find items to progress when you encounter roadblocks. To compare it to another modern game, it basically reminded me of the setup in Shantae Half Genie Hero. Of course, the highlight is seeing the story play out through the animated cutscenes, and the animators and voice actors absolutely nailed the style. Easily recommended if you're the kind of person that feels nostalgia for classics like The King Downloads Sony Vegas. Before I get into the top 2, here's a few honourable mentions. I played Super Mario Land for the first time when it came to NSO. It was neat but unmistakably a product of its time as a launch title for Nintendo's first go at this whole handheld console thing. I did beat it though, unlike the rest of the honourable mentions. I just don't have much to say about it. Monster Hunter Rise went on a really cheap sale earlier this year, and I was in the mood for trying something different, so I decided to give it a go. Also helped that it was recommended by a friend, and I think it was the best Monster Hunter to get me interested in the series with how pick up and play its structure is. As a somewhat recently minted fan of both Dragon Quest and Xenoblade, I knew Chrono Trigger was a game I needed to experience at some point, and yeah, I can see why it's one of the all-time greats. I've been really enjoying it so far, but I still haven't actually finished it. I'm right near the end as well. I'll get around to it at some point. Generally speaking, I don't tend to play fighting games too much outside of Super Smash Bros, but this year I found myself getting into the Dead or Alive games. Yes, Dead or Alive is probably most well known for that, but there's also a fun fighting game at the core of the series too. I picked up the second game on Dreamcast earlier in the year, and started playing Dimensions on my 3DS pretty recently, and I'm actually getting quite into it. Probably helps that there's kind of some DNA from Sega fighters in there, since the series started on Sega arcade hardware, and uses a 3-button system similar to their fighters. Also, Dimensions has impressed me with how well it plays for such an early game on the 3DS. Still stuck at fighting games though. Since the online shutdown for the 3DS and Wii U, I've modded both of my consoles, and one of the first things I did on my 3DS was grab the translation patch for Puyo Puyo Chronicle, since I wanted to try it out for a while now, having been a fan of the series for quite a few years. The overall package is pretty solid, but I do have to agree with the reviews of the time that noted that the RPG story mode, which is what I wanted to try the game for, is fairly repetitive. I think this will be one to tackle sort of periodically with breaks rather than binging. Otherwise, I think I'll burn myself out. I started writing this script about a day or two before Christmas, because, you know, nothing beats a super rushed out video. I got Dragon Quest III HD 2D Remake for Christmas. So I've obviously not had much time with the game so far, but it's already proving better than the old Switch version that's based on the old mobile ports. So far, apart from the honourable mentions which have been grouped together, this list has mostly just been in the order that I played the games in throughout the year. I'm not really one for ranking games in an order of like best to worst, because frankly, I kind of find it difficult to order games in how much I like them. But I do have a top 2 for this list. My favourite game released this year, and my favourite game that I played this year that wasn't released this year. So without further ado, it's time for the top 2, and first up, my favourite game from before 2024. Every now and then, you come across a game that just hits different, where you can tell it's something special long before you finish it, and you immediately want to share how good it is with all your friends. CrossCode is absolutely one of those games for me. It already makes a good first impression with the art, the intriguing story introduction, and it just keeps building from there. Story isn't always something I look for in games, but when one clicks with me, it really clicks, and CrossCode is no exception. I wouldn't want to spoil things for those who haven't played it, but its twists were always effective, and they explored themes I wasn't really expecting, and that felt actually pretty relevant in 2024. In particular, I really want to praise the characters and setting. CrossCode is set inside the fictional MMO of the future, Crossworlds, and as such, most of the characters are actually just people playing the game. And the writing is incredibly well done, where everyone feels like an actual person. You get insights into their lives outside of the game, and the more important characters get to show a nice emotional range. This even applies to the main character, Leah, who is effectively a silent protagonist since she can't really speak, but despite this, she has a very well-defined personality, thanks both to the writing of other characters, the writing of her limited vocabulary, and the artwork throughout the whole game. I love how CrossCode looks, both with the varied environments that boast great attention to detail and character sprites that perfectly capture the personality of everyone, both overworld sprites and the character portraits in cutscenes, especially Leah's shocked face and some of the other emotions she gets to show during the story, which again, don't want to spoil for those who haven't played the game. As if that wasn't enough, the gameplay is top notch too. I'd best describe CrossCode as an action RPG with Zelda-like dungeons, with a large emphasis on combat and puzzles. Of course it does more than that, but that's an easy way to describe it. It's a pretty common joke in the community to call CrossCode just a puzzle game, since the dungeons can get pretty puzzle heavy, but I don't think that's too much of a bad thing if you ask me. They really nailed that aha feeling that comes from solving a puzzle that had you stumped just moments before, matched with the oh no, what do I do here feeling as the gears have to start turning in your head in the start of the next room. And when the game shifts to combat, the gloves are off as you start dashing around the room and the enemies, learning and executing on their weaknesses, where then you can lay the oh so satisfying beat down on them once you break them. And it culminates in boss fights that combine the fast-paced combat with fast-paced puzzle solving that test you in the good ways good boss fights always should. The music is excellent too, perfectly matching every situation it plays with, and has entered my regular music rotation. Still waiting on that CD I ordered to be shipped though. CrossCode really is something special, and might just be my favourite game I played this year, but it has some pretty tough competition from the final game on this list. My favourite game from 2024. I'm a huge Sonic fan. That much is obvious, I think. I usually find something to look forward to with every release, and Sonic X Shadow Generations was no exception. What we all thought would be an alright port of Sonic Generations with a little shadow part on the side wound up being much more. When half of that wound up being basically true, the Sonic Generations remaster is perfectly fine, with minimal changes to the actual game itself since, really, Sonic Generations was already one of the best in the series when it launched over a decade ago, and it still is to this day. I know complaints have been made at the rewritten script and slight animation and model changes, but I think those people have forgotten that Sonic Generations hardly had any story to begin with. Do I miss some of the original lines? Sure, but I think the new ones are fine too, and the story is hardly the point of this game. I don't really see any problems with the anniversary game that's meant to celebrate the series' history, referencing the history of the series. Besides, the real meat of this package for anyone who's been continuously playing Sonic Generations for years is Shadow Generations. A whole new game set during the events of Sonic's story that also acts as a sequel to Shadow's 2005 game. And this game has ended up being my favourite Sonic Team game developed since, well, the original Sonic Generations. I quite liked Frontiers, and I can find things to enjoy in Lost World and Forces, but Shadow Generations shows Sonic Team truly back on form. Gone is a complete departure from all established gameplay styles. Gone are levels that end as soon as they're getting started. Gone is the feeling that the game is held together with tape and hope. Shadow Generations may not give us many levels, but every single one is well designed and, most importantly, very replayable. Replayability is at the core of what makes Sonic special, and every level in Shadow Generations is precisely built to facilitate this. They all have a plethora of branching paths and are full of opportunities to shave just that little bit off your time on each run. Each level also feels distinct from each other, with unique stage design and gimmicks that keep things fresh throughout. They're also probably the meatiest stages in a Sonic game since Unleashed, and all have a nice sense of progression through each area they represent. They don't just feel like video game levels that start and end in the same place. Good levels wouldn't mean much though, if the character you had to take them through didn't control well, and thankfully, Shadow controls incredibly well. They've managed to strike a balance between the more precise feeling control of the open zones and Frontiers, and the more weighty, tankier feel of the original Generations, where Shadow always goes where you want him to, but he feels like he has actual weight and presence in the world. Shadow's unique powers all work pretty well too, even the ones that feel situational at first, especially Chaos Spear, which on the surface is only really meant for activating switches and stunning certain enemies. It also gives the game a probably unintentional movement tech which just raises the skill ceiling even higher. The new powers are integrated nicely into the levels, with each one getting some time to shine in either a main level or throughout the hub world. The one exception, sort of, to this high quality is Doom Morph, where Sega continues the trend of leaving a game mechanic completely unexplained. But when you do realise how it works fine. Shoutouts to that one person on Twitter who drew a diagram to explain how it worked and made it so much easier for everyone playing. The soundtrack was a pretty safe area to set expectations high, considering it's a Sonic game, and I'm happy to say it's great as always. Lots of nice remixes like Sonic Generations before it, and it's probably a more consistently good soundtrack than Sonic Superstars' inconsistent collection of music last year. Even the part of a Sonic game that I tend to consider the least important impressed me here. Now, don't get me wrong, I do like Shadow, especially how he's shown in Sonic Adventure 2 and, more recently, in the third Sonic movie, and he was probably the best character in Sonic 06's complete mess of a story, but my preference has always skewed towards the classic characters. But Shadow Generations manages to make me really care about Shadow, and without spoiling things too much, it's probably the most emotional I've gotten over a story in probably any Sonic game. Since it's a side story, it's smaller in scope than something like Frontiers or Unleashed, but it tells that story very well. Character animation is also the best it's been in years, possibly, arguably, the best it's ever been from Sonic Team. And overall the game's visuals impress, with great material work, improved technical details, and finally delivering a 3D Sonic game at a higher than 60 FPS refresh rate on PC, which is something I've been wanting for years. So, in case you couldn't tell by the way I went on about it longer than any other game on this list, I really liked Shadow Generations. It's probably going to be in my rotation of current games for a long time, just like Sonic Generations, which is probably some of the highest praise I can give a game in general. That got a bit out of hand by the end there. Well, that's the list. Maybe we'll do this again next year.